Okay, well, let's come to order. It's really good to see you all again. Today we're moving into, I'll say a little more about, well, a lot more about this, the so-called normative dimension of thinking. But remember, get back to that in just a moment. Last time we looked at the descriptive dimension, this time the normative dimension. But remember, our overall goal is to explore a bit of what Christianity and other religions say about the tough questions of life. We want to explore the questions and their answers, and hopefully find resources for our own living, our own confronting of the befuddling issue that how to live is not hardwired into human existence. We are an instinct poor species, as I noted before. I also noted last time that the attentive person, all of you, marvel over what is seemingly obvious to many others. The old maxim is that philosophy begins in wonder, theology begins with awe. So we are wondering about the awesome reality of our religious and moral lives. Now, last time I also tried to suggest we could break down the hard question of life, that is, how we should live, into 5 sub-questions that all interact in complex ways, but will provide some structure for thinking about that tough question of life. What were the 5 questions? They interact, they're not in hierarchical order. Last time we looked at the seemingly simple question, what is going on? We found out that wasn't so seemingly simple. Today we're looking at the normative question, which is, what are the norms and values that should guide our living? We'll look at the practical dimension of thinking about life, which answers the question, what should we be and do right now? We're going to start approaching that today, actually. Fourth, this is a tough question of life we're trying to get at. We are implicated. Doing this kind of thinking is not the same as doing geology. Rocks aren't out there. We are the subject matter. And so what I call the fundamental question is, what does it mean to live as an agent, an actor in relation to others and the divine? And the 5th question is, are all of our beliefs about the first 4 true? Or have we been deceived somewhere? Right now, there's many people in our country realizing they've been deceived. This is the so-called meta-ethical dimension for odd scholarly reasons. But the questions are straightforward, or seemingly, and they interact. As I noted last time, if you looked at the riots, or were they protests, or was it sedition, or was it treason? All of those are different moral interpretations of the events of January 6th, driven by different values and norms, giving rise to different understandings of what it means to be an agent in this country. So we're engaged in fairly comprehensive thinking here. And today we turn to this befuddling issue of what is meant by good and bad, right and wrong, good and evil. And we're going to use these 2 texts I'm going to read right now. And in a moment, we're going to see what you think about them before I pick up with 2 strands of thought. The first is from Genesis 3:22 to 23. Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore, the Lord God sent him from the garden to till the ground from which he was taken, unquote. Since we're doing comparative religious thought, this quote is from the Bhagavad Gita, one of the most famous of the Indian epics, or part of an epic. Quote, think thou also of thy duty, and do not waver. There is no greater good for a warrior than to fight in a righteous war, unquote. Pretty different statements. In a moment, I'm going to distinguish between value theory, and for those who are interested in fancy terms for these things, that's called axiology. And then I'm going to explore a theory of obligation. After all, the passage from the Gita is about the obligation of Arjuna. The passage from Genesis is about axiology. What do we value? What's good? Those terms, axiology and deontology, for theory of obligation, are big words for common experiences. All of us have an obligation. We do. You fulfilled an obligation by showing up on time. Where did the idea come that you should show up on time? But first, what are some of your own thoughts about the god Krishna telling Arjuna to fight in a war, even against some of his own relatives? And what are some of your thoughts about those famous words in Genesis? Let's just take a couple minutes here to think about that. So you all should know where the hand raising function is. You go down to reactions on the bottom of your screen. If you click that, you'll see a little bar that says raise hand. And you can click that and your hand will go up, and then you can click it again and it will go down. So what do you think of these, just off the top of your head? What do you think of these passages? David. David? Unmute, please. In fact, you can probably, yeah, there we go.
Carol just whispered good trouble in my ear, but my question was define righteous in terms of war.
We're going to come to that.
Good.
You're already starting to decode the problems. What would make a duty right? What would it make it righteous to participate in a war? Anyone else?
That's such a difficult question. For me, it comes to how does one define right? And it's.
What do you mean? What do you mean by? You're absolutely correct. I was going to say you're absolutely right. You're absolutely correct. What do you think right means? I know I'm putting you on the spot, and there's a reason for this. Because within all of our lives, these ideas are running around.
Yeah, so
we can excavate our own experience to try to understand what's going on. Marcy, please.
Yeah, so it's that I guess it's that personal code that makes me true to myself and to those that have raised me, or that community that I belong to, and God. So what I know is that is what's right. I can't. It's, I don't know.
No, it's very good. That's very good. And you noted that something is right. The obligation arises from social relations, from your relation to yourself, for a religious person like Arjuna. After all, it is the god Krishna who says this. Arjuna is not talking to himself, right? So it can come from a god. In fact, in Genesis, God is afraid that human beings are going to become like her, him, they, whatever it is, by being knowing good and evil and being immortal, right? Anyone else before we move on? Myron.
You know, just going by this week, watching those who take covenants and oaths,
Yes.
and living by that.
Fabulous. We're going to see that one of the roots of obligation is the odd fact that human beings can make promises. And a covenant is a promise. Why do I say that's an odd fact? So, Myron, let me keep you on the spot. I don't get to do this very often, folks. So
That's okay.
Now, you took a covenant with your wife.
Yes.
When did you do that?
40 some years ago.
Did you know that you were committing yourself for 40 years into the future when you took that vow?
Do you know, when I was about to take my vow, it really hit me that, oh my God. I have pictures of me sweating. It hit me
that was probably incorrect given the wonderful wife you have, but
yes,
but it's correct.
But you do think about it. You do think about what you're committing yourself to.
And you're assuming you're going to exist in the future.
Yes.
And you assume that the person who's going to exist in the future, who does not exist now, is going to abide by the same covenant.
Absolutely.
So this is a really strange thing about human beings, that we can imagine and project a future we commit ourselves to in the present. And that's one root of obligation, as we'll see. Anyone else before we turn to value and obligation? Anyone else on those passages that I just noted? Going once? Okay. Are we ready to move on? Shall we move on? Me talking a little bit more? We're going to turn to a theory of value. Now, what does that mean? A value is simply something you care about, that is important to you, and gives you reasons for acting. An example: I love my son. I value him. And that was the reason. It explains my action for why I went today to look at a house that he and his wife are thinking of buying, even though I also had to prepare for this class, right? Now, I also value the class. So what we care about, what we value, what it gives us reasons to act can conflict. And we'll have to start ordering them in some way. Like the love of one's child or the love of teaching. Values can conflict. That's why, whether we admit it or not, we all have some scale of values. Some things we care about are more important than other things we care about. All we mean by value is that what you care about that gives you a reason for action. If someone does something, you can say, well, why did you do that? And we expect them to give us some kind of value answer. Well, I did it because Peg's my friend, right? So let's take just a moment. List me some things or persons or events or activities you value. This is supposed to be dialogical here, folks. There has to be things you care about. I know you do. Mary Clark does. She says church. That's very
Church
good.
and family.
Church and family. Okay. Peg.
Friends.
Friends. Rita writes, my family, my job. Anyone else? Monty says fun. Yes. Yes. Johnny. Johnny, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I want to say a value of my commitment to organizations.
Okay. Paula says her parrot. Jan says music. Myron says, good for you, Myron. Voting. Anyone else? Cycling, I see. Okay, what's happening here? Melissa said to everyone, nature, yes. What's education, David says. We could go on forever. So, but then we got a problem. If it's just a confusing array of things that people care about, how are we ever going to give them any order? Well, this has befuddled thinkers for a long time. And I myself stand in a line of thought that wants to argue that there are types and subtypes of basic goods, basic values. Okay. I think by the end today we're gonna see there's 5, but I think there's basically 4 types of values that already have come up in your own descriptions. They have the following names. First are bodily goods. That is, goods of health, fun, food, sex, exercise, the things that we do to sustain ourselves as bodily creatures. Next are social goods. Family, friendship, colleagues, church. We're social beings. We have social needs. We value them. Now you should note that within each one of these types, people also make rankings. Someone might like food more than health, for instance, in bodily goods, or prefer family over their colleagues. We hope so. So there's going to be rankings in each one of these. Fourth, there are what we can call reflective goods. Goods of meaning, language, art, education. Things that satisfy the fact that human beings are rational creatures. We desperately seek to understand the world. If you've ever been around, and I'm sure we all have, little teeny children, they're just gobbling up the world. By the way, the American educational system nixes that in little children, unfortunately. One of our problems. And fourth, I think we can say, this was already mentioned too, there is the basic good of what I call locality. Land, nature, environments we exist in, stable communities, more abstractly, social environments. The attack of fake news was an attack against the locality of a stable social environment. Now, these 4 types of basic goods we're going to use to compare the passage from the Gita and from the Bible. Because if the theory's right, we'll find them there. And if we find them there, it's showing us that millennia of people have given us a way to think about the organizing our lives. The task of human existence is to integrate these in some way, right? if you never take care of your body, you're not going to have an integral life. You're going to die. We know what happens when people are removed from healthy, sustaining social environments. Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic, wrote a fabulous treatise when it was under the Soviets about how the deception in the media destroyed the capacity of many people to live a meaningful life. So our problem is how to integrate these, but we first of all need to think about them, okay? Is this making sense, folks?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It should, parentheses, this should be, you should be at some point sitting back and saying, well, that's bleeding obvious. Schweiker, what's the big deal here? That's the point. The careful mind wonders about what is often taken to be obvious. We're trying to bring deeper insight and understanding of our actual lives in the world. Ethics is not about some extraterrestrial realm or some beings that do not exist right now. We're thinking about actual human life. And I saw a hand, Paula. And Peg, Paula first.
You're probably going to get to this sooner or later, probably sooner, but when you were listing the 4 categories of values or goods, I paused when you put church under social. I can see why it goes there because it's a social event, but is that the 5th value that you're going to get to, that there's something beyond?
It's going to actually be a 6th.
Oh, okay.
But we're only getting to 5 today. But you put your finger on something absolutely important to understand about religion. Every religion encompasses all of these goods and tries to answer them. We come to church every Sunday to be fed bodily goods with the cloud of witnesses, social goods. Through a liturgy, the work of purpose, people that is to explain to us through language and ritual the meaning of our lives. And we do it in the locality of the church on earth and the church in heaven. That is also, we could see in the quote from the Gita, which I'll go through in a moment, okay?
Thank you.
Notice that these are tools to unpack one's daily life and understand it in more careful ways. Peg, you got your hand up, and then we're going to start some comparative work.
What I immediately thought of was, as you were listing the values, was how that made me think about people who have a completely different set of values than I do. You know, we just have seen and continue to see such a divisive feeling in this country. And I know a lot of us are going, what the heck are those people thinking about? You know, how can they believe that?
Yeah,
this is what I first thought of.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Peg. This is also an account of human conflict. Let me read you another quote. I wasn't going to do this, although it's one of my favorite. It comes from a dialogue by Plato called the Euthyphro. Very fabulous dialogue, famous in the history of ethics. Socrates is outside of the courtroom. He's about to be taken in and be condemned and then poisoned for corrupting the youth and creating new gods. He meets this young man, Euthyphro, who's taking his own father to court. Why? Because the gods told him to. This befuddled Socrates. And at one point early in the dialogue, he writes to follow. This is right on Peg's point. But what sort of things would make us enemies? Socrates says, angry at each other. If we disagreed about it and are unable to reach a decision, perhaps you Euthyphro cannot say offhand, but I suggest that you consider whether it not be the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, good and evil. Are not these things, when we disagree about them and cannot reach a satisfactory decision concerning which we on occasion, will we not become enemies, you and I, and all men? In other words, folks, human beings are driven by what they care about. This is one of the reasons why, in my opinion, and then I got to stop riffing and start lecturing, although I am lecturing. This is one of the reasons why everyone's befuddled. Why can't you convince someone to change their political views? Well, the reason why is because holding political views is a value, it's not an intellectual demand. If you want to change views, you have to change what people care about. And that's really complicated. So yes, Peg, we're looking at also a way to decode conflicts. Now let's consider the Gita and the Bible. So let's see if this allows us to compare them. And first, let's turn to the Gita. Traditional Hindi society was organized in families and caste. At the top of the scale are the Brahmins or priests. Then we go down through rulers to warriors like Arjuna, homeowners, and finally the so-called untouchables. Reality is strictly ordered. To fill one's caste duties is a good thing. That's what Krishna is saying to Arjuna. The duties of caste exceed Arjuna's worry about killing those who are different from him or in his own family. So what defines a good warrior is actually three things: caste, doing one's duty, and a righteous war. Come back to the righteous war stuff in a moment, okay? So even the concept good warrior needs to be pulled apart. Just in that one sentence from the Gita, now you know why sacred texts generate millennia of commentary, because they're kind of complex. Now, this also entails a view of reality, what I will call later in the fundamental dimension of moral thought. How so? Well, in the Hindu text, human actions affect materially future conditions such that one is part of a web called karma. Myron already explained how he was in a karmic web through the act of promise making. So if Arjuna does not do his duty as a warrior, then there will be effects for his future life and also the possibility of his rebirth. Rebirth out of the cycles of suffering. What is more, the inner essence of all things, of all the realities of appearances to us, me, you appearing on the screen, you appearing to me, you seeing my fountain pen, you turning around and seeing a picture on your wall, you looking at a loved one, the inner reality of all those different things is the same. It is Brahman. And Arjuna must learn that war is just an appearance. It's not real. His caste, his family, his enemy, even his own self, inner self, called Atman, are in fact united in Brahman, as is everything else. All is one. So, Arjuna, in fact, is not killing unjustly. He's not going to destroy Brahman. The war is an illusion fabricated by the human mind. Enlightenment is to see this, is to understand this, is to be grasped by the oneness of Brahman. And that enlightenment frees one from the rounds of rebirth. Pretty amazing, right? So, Arjuna, don't worry about it. It's not real anyway. Do your duty, and maybe you'll get out, maybe you'll be enlightened and get out of this mess. Let's turn to the Bible. Here too, we have a vision of reality that is ordered out of chaos. Importantly, the God of the Bible and creation is not through warfare, as it was for the Greek gods, or the Babylonian gods, or the Norse gods. And furthermore, this God who is ordering chaos calls it good. In other words, God perceives something, recognizes it as good. So there's an interesting relation between God seeing something and it being good. Creation is ordered through types of being. Light versus dark, sea versus land, fish of the sea versus those who crawl out onto the ground, and so on, culminating in the dust creature, Adima, who is meant to be God's steward, and meant to be. So notice also that creation, while it's ordered in a way that's similar or has an analogy to the Gita, but unlike the Gita, creation in the biblical account has a beginning, even as there's a natural created order. There is no beginning in the Hindi mythology. There is in the biblical mythology. And by the way, folks, myth is not a bad term. It's trying to say something very profoundly true through images and stories. And I hope you're starting to see that there seems to be some truth in these ancient texts. Some people do see creation as conflict, as warfare. Some do think that, well, we're all one in some profound way. The biblical and other religious texts are doing this. Now, let's go on. This dust creature is set in a garden, and so the good of locality. But he lacks, he, she, it, whatever it is at that point, lacks a social good. And so this benevolent God creates a partner. Interestingly enough, they do not learn about their bodily goods until after they disobey a command, a duty of God, not to eat from the tree of good and evil. And when they do, their eyes are opened. Now notice, what defines a good dust creature in the biblical text is not knowledge of good and evil. It's obedience to God. Dietrich Bonhoeffer once wrote in his Ethics that in the beginning, human beings only knew one thing, and that was God. The knowledge of good and evil in the biblical text is a sign of our fallenness. Ethics begins with sin, oddly enough. Now, the punishment for their sin is not rebirth, as it would be in the Gita because of bad karma, condemning one to live in illusion and suffering. And just anecdotally, when we were in, when I've been in India and in China, folks are out at the temples in the most horrendous states, and people just walk by them because it's their fault anyway, right? They're the ones who created the karmic evil that's besetting them. That doesn't happen in the biblical text. Something equally bad happens. Because Adam and Eve, they now have names, know good and evil in some abstract sense, but they do not know how to apply that knowledge in particular situations. That's why this myth is saying we're all confused when we have to make an actual decision. It's a mark of our having some sense of what is good and bad, but being very confused about a particular situation. Well, what about my love of my son, but my love of teaching? Gosh, they conflict. What am I supposed to do? I saw Beverly's hand up real quick.
Good and evil, I've always been concerned. I'd be interested to know your take on why was it when they were naked was that bad? Because God created the human form. God had seen them naked all that time. Why did they view it then as bad after they ate from the tree of good and evil? It never made sense to me.
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting point. Because elsewhere, remember, the dust creature is created to be a steward with God. And in one of the creation stories, there's that stewardship includes procreation. So that human beings naturally, as they're created, are participating in this incredible creation of life that we have in the early Genesis stories, right? And this is a second of the stories. Notice what's happening here. A religious text is giving different answers to the same question. So we can get to start thinking about the differences and the debates. I think that the real problem here is not that they are bodily, it's that they hid from God. And that opens their eyes to their mortality, their nakedness. So it's not that their bodies are bad. See, this is why it's coupled with the tree of eternal life. In other words, to become godlike is to become immortal and to know good and evil. So it's really more about the disclosure of their mortality, right? So the punishment is not rebirth. The punishment is actually a kind of banishment to the harshness of mortal existence. Bodily, to enmity between themselves and other creatures, the snake, and even in terms of the goods of locality, you got to sweat a lot to make money to feed yourself, right? So there's an analogy to the kind of punishment that the Gita suggests, in that you're cast back into illusion and suffering for karmic bad actions. but it's understood differently. The same goods are involved, but it's understood differently. So I really think it's more about their attempt to conceal themselves from the divine and the fear that they will become immortal. Because elsewhere, and this is why a faithful Jewish couple has sex every Friday night, the Sabbath. It's a good thing to participate in the fecundity of life. It's later Christian problems about the body, which we can get into later if you want. But if we just stick with the myth, it's more complicated. I should note, folks, that's true just about everything that you hear. If you go back to the text, you'll find they're more complicated. Tom.
Might note that our idea of naked is often sort of a synonym for vulnerable also.
Yes, that'd be right. That'd be right. That'd be right. Let's see, where are we at? So this good God does punish them, and they will die. He promised they will die. It's just they're not going to die on the spot. They're exiled, and that set enmity between them and other animals, the problem of locality, the land isn't going to produce, but God preserves them and then does a remarkable thing, finally at Sinai, and that is to give a teaching, Torah, the 10 Commandments and the rest of the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Bible, and the 613 commands for faithful Jews. That is all to help these strange beings who are outside of Eden have some knowledge of good and evil, but don't know how in the world to make decisions or order their lives. Okay? So we can see, I hope, already that there are analogies, similarities and differences between Genesis and the Gita. And both of them are trying to clarify the basic goods of human existence and how they are to be related. And we should note, this is very important, that in both texts, what is given a pride of place is not the body, it's not sociality, it's not locality, it's knowledge. Which seems to suggest that the human good would be a life in which we knowingly and understandingly integrate in some way these basic goods, the different types, as we want, freely, unless it violates a duty. We'll come to that next. Our job, the job of human existence, is to integrate ourselves knowingly in wisdom. This is why, in a fabulous quote, let me see if I can get it real quickly, that Jan sent me from James Baldwin. Jan, do you have that up by chance? I got it. Oh, where is it? I'm sorry, I can't find it right off the bat, but it has to do that with if you demean knowledge, if you destroy human knowledge, the uptake is going to be violence and conflict.
I found it.
Okay, read it out.
It is certain in any case that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have.
I think that describes the last, right? So that is one of the reasons these texts think that you have to go through life, if you want to have a peaceful, integrated life, knowingly. And then they set up all the things you're supposed to know, like the Torah, like the Hindi myths that are to help us think about this. Now, do we want to take a short break, or do you want me to plow on to from value to obligation? And then we're going to have time, I hope, for some discussion. Shall I plow on or a break? Plow on. Hey, I'm impressed. Maybe I've had my mic on mute, so it's not as boring as one would expect. Okay, so we've been trying to talk about values as what moves us to act, reasons for actions, that we can give different types of values, went through 4, and that those, and actually the 4 in my own scholarly career has arisen from reading classic religious texts. They've been adduced from those. Other thinkers have come up with them in different ways. But now we're going to turn to a term that is much disdained and worried about today, and that is duty, obligation. We've seen that Arjuna has a duty to his caste and his family. And with respect to enlightenment, he has duties to himself. The dust creature and its partner have duties to their creator, and we assume to each other. But those duties for them are not rooted in caste, but in God's command. Human beings are profoundly social creatures, not just rational, social creatures. And we are surrounded by, and we live within, a web of obligations, whether we like it or not. So please, another chance for you to jump in. Can some yell out or sing out some obligations you have?
Writing assignments.
What?
Writing assignments.
Writing assignments, yes.
Caring for your family.
Care for your family, work.
Taxes.
Not parking on a snow route.
Not parking on civil obligations. Paying bills I have here. What else?
Paying taxes.
Paying taxes.
Obeying the law.
Obeying the law.
Sacrificing.
Sacrificing, obeying social norms, Rita puts in. We already know from Myron, keeping one's promises. So we exist, folks, in webs of duties and obligations. And that is interrelated with David's question early on about a righteous war. There is a whole history in most cultures of reflection on when you can disobey, as a soldier, disobey a duty to go to war because it is unjust or unrighteous. And different traditions, I could do this in the Christian tradition, but it'd take us rather far afield. Different traditions have reflections on what makes a war justifiable or righteous. Because they're realistic to know that, guess what? Since, as Peg pointed out, and Plato as well, since people have different values, care about different things, there's going to be possible conflict. The religions are incredibly realistic about human existence. Now, granting all of these obligations that we just noted, which have different grounds, God, promise making, our society's obligations, the legislation, passing laws, our own covenants, contracts, means to a desired end? Is there any specific crucial duty that we have simply because we're human beings in relation to others? Are there moral obligations? Our obligations to others and to ourselves? Well, you already know the answer. It's of course there are. And they're usually put in the following way. Last time I noted Rabbi Hillel, 110 BCE to 10 CE, was asked to teach the whole Torah. Remember, this is the Torah given by God, if we the story, to help these strange creatures know how to live their lives, since they don't seem to be able to apply the notions of good and evil very well. We have a question. Rita, your question is, she says, aren't morals taught rather than intuited? That's a debate we're going to get to later. Different thinkers and traditions understand those in different ways, interestingly enough. We'll get to that later, okay? Fabulous question. Right now, we're bracketing that. At any rate, Hillel was asked to teach the whole Torah while standing on one foot, and he replied, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow." That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn. It's in the Talmud. That is called the silver rule, because the golden rule is the same proposition stated in the positive. Do unto others what you'd have done unto you. These formulations are found in virtually all of the religions of the world. The Mahabharata, the epic of which the Gita is a part, has this statement later on, quote, "This is the sum of duty. Do not unto others what you would not have them do unto you," unquote. It's almost as if he was, although it's much earlier than Hillel, maybe Hillel studied Hindu thought, I don't know. Very smart people tend to run up against the same problems and come out with similar answers. So we have two rules that are taken to define the specific moral obligations we have to others. Now let's pick them apart. They're more complicated than they seem, which is why Hillel says, go and learn. Does anyone have a comment on either of the rules before I start picking them apart? Any ideas yourself?
I have seen a poster that has that same Hillel rule attributed to, it was a big circle and it had just about every religion that's recognized. Mm-hmm. They've all had some version of it.
Right. That's right. Because religions, as I said last time, are about, they're practical. They're about how human beings can and should live. They include very abstract things like karma or creation, sin, very complicated things, but they're basically about how we should get on in life. Well, let me pick apart the golden and silver rules, okay? First of all, we should note they assume an asymmetry of power. You can do something to someone else that will harm them. They can do something to you. The rule is about relations of asymmetry. Second, and surprisingly, within that asymmetry, the rule says No, affirm equal regard. Or as Jesus later puts it, love your neighbor as yourself. The other person is to be treated as you want to be treated. So within the asymmetries of power, one person's acting, another person's receiving their action, there has to be the affirmation of equal regard. Third, these are rules for actions. They're concerned with what is a right act within asymmetries of powers, but affirming moral equality. Melissa says, unless I assume you're identical and also identical situated, I need to find a way to know who and where you are in order to know how I will want to be treated by you. Yes, that's absolutely right. These rules have to be filled in relationship to the whole complexity of the levels of goods we went through. So if I'm to know how to treat someone else as myself, I have to know something about bodily goods, social goods, and so on. Yes, there's a lot of work that goes in to filling out these rules. So asymmetries of power, equality of consideration, a rule for action. Notice they also entail some desire, this relates to the question just put, some desire for some good. Do unto others as you would want to be done unto you. And remember, values are merely things we care about and want. So there's desires for these basic goods built into the rule. And fifth, they imply what's called reciprocity. That is, we are both committed to treating the other as we would want to be treated. If I treat you some way, I remember when I was a little kid, this just shows that ethics arises because there is sin. When my younger sister would mistreat me, I would say, and then I would give her a whack or whatever. My mom would get upset and I would say, but look, I'm following the golden rule. If she hurt me, which means she must want to be hit back. I violated some of the other aspects of that. And sixth, I'm sorry, we have a sixth one, which is called, big term here, but important, universality. What does that mean? The golden and silver rules are attacks on hypocrisy. They're saying, you can't tell someone else not to hurt you and then you go along and hurt them. And that applies to every human being in these kinds of relations of asymmetry. Okay, so these 6 attributes or aspects of the golden and silver rules, I'm going to be bold enough and assume that you hadn't thought that these rules were that complicated, but they are. They also imply something not just about action, but also about the character of the person involved. The golden rule is saying I should do beneficent actions to others from a benevolent character. Silver rule is saying do not engage in non-maleficent actions out of a vicious or malevolent character. So to really live out the rules requires us to be struggle to be a certain kind of people, which we come by trying to live by the rules. Think of John Wesley's 3 rules. Do no harm, non-maleficence. Do good, beneficence. Stay in love with God. Or in the Torah, there are 613 mitzvot. That is, good actions. A person is to do a mitzvah, a good act, a good thing. John Calvin, Christian Reformation theologian, argued that each of the 10 commandments, which are initially stated negatively, do not steal, entail a positive injunction. Aid your neighbor's economic life. It's a brilliant commentary on the 10 commandments, which he thinks Jesus was the perfect interpreter of the 10 commandments. My point here is that in addition to the golden and silver rules, we have duties of beneficence and benevolence, as well as non-maleficence and malice. Do not act out of malice. Now, let me note one more thing. We're getting close to the end, and then our discussion. For the religions, if one acts on the golden or silver rule, then a new kind of goodness comes into being. A good person and the right action. So in addition to the 4 basic goods, we can now add a 5th good. That is the moral good, the morally good person. Does everyone follow that? This is why Hillel says, Torah is all about, that's the whole of the Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn. And as one fulfills the golden and silver rules, you are bringing into being a new kind of character, a new kind of person, a good person, a virtuous person. This is how the virtues are formed. So the moral good is when an individual or a community decides to integrate all those goods of life and values in relationship to the golden or silver rule, and therefore a life of benevolence and beneficence. That is to say, a virtuous life. And in a sense, ironically enough, that is what Krishna is saying to Arjuna. If you act on this duty, you will bring into being a new creature. We'll call that enlightenment. Now, let me conclude and then we'll have open discussion for a good 15, 20 minutes. I hope you've grasped 3 things today. First, that given different convictions about what is of value, as well as right and wrong actions, we can see not only conflicts between people, but also analogies between religions. Secondly, these analogies arise because each of these traditions we've explored today assume that there's some paradox or tension or antinomy in human existence. Knowledge of good and evil, but not eternal life. Duties of caste, but illusion about what is really going on in the world. And third, they're making a claim about a distinctly moral good that arises when, in seeking our own basic goods, we nonetheless treat others as we would like to be treated, which is a more astonishing thing in human affairs than we oftentimes want to admit. Okay, now that's what I wanted to say today. I hope I didn't go on too long. Let's throw it open to whatever questions, concerns you have to each other or to me, and we'll go from there. I have no further prompt than that. You can raise your hand or put a comment in the chat.
I have a question. I didn't catch what you said when 3 things from today and the second was illusion of reality, like illusion.
Both the Gita and the Bible think that human beings are odd creatures because we have tensions in our lives. The biblical tension is you have the knowledge of good and evil, but you ain't eternal. And you're going to be confused. Your whole life is going to be spent trying to figure out your whole life. The Gita's tension is Arjuna knows the duties of his caste. He's not confused about that, but he doesn't have a clue about what is really real. Because what's going on, and he's standing on this mountain looking down at a warfare in the valley, that ain't real. Brahman is real. And I've been trying to say through this course that religions love to play with these tensions. And rather than reducing one side to the other, they try to figure out a way to help us live within the tensions. I think that's one of the differences between religion and philosophy. Philosophy tries to reduce these things. Michael, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was thinking about the golden rule, and I was thinking about in the requirement of reciprocity and universality. And then I was, which kind of goes a step beyond an expectation of reciprocity. And then also a little bit different nuance of Jesus is a summary of the Torah as being the Shema, love your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, as opposed to the golden rule, which was a little bit different. So I wonder if those two are connected with in thought.
Yes. I think, and it's global, speaking globally, the command to love one's enemies is so revolutionary that it's hard to, there really isn't many comparisons to this. There are ways to stop warfare, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which Gandhi once said, if you follow that completely, everyone will end up blind. Okay. But an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth was meant to stop warfare at a point where there's equality of damage done. It's to stop cycles of revenge. And Jesus is giving another way to stop cycles of revenge. We already know, thanks to Peg, I don't know where she is on the screen, and Plato, that human conflict comes out of the fact that people disagree about what's good and bad, beautiful and ugly. They disagree because they value different things. And this can lead, as Peg noted and as Plato noted, can lead to warfare, unending conflict. So Jesus is giving a way out of cycles of revenge, which are built on the notion of equal reciprocity. See, if you hurt me, then I hurt you back. One of the most unchristian, I'm sorry, folks, I'm going to let my politics out here for a moment, but this is a class. I'm not in the sanctuary. That was for Myron. When Donald Trump said, when he is hurt, he hits back 10 times harder, it is the most unimaginatively non-Christian statement that anyone could ever make. because it puts one again in cycles of revenge. Now, we'd have to decode further what the love is that Jesus is talking about. I would index it towards respect of the basic goods that another person needs. So I shouldn't starve my enemy, right? If you want to get out of cycle of revenges, you have to start meeting needs and basic goods. Is this getting to your question, Michael? It's absolutely revolutionary. And
Yeah.
the history of Christian ethics is the way some thinkers have hedged that, the radicality of it. Some have insisted upon taking it in its most radical extreme. Some have said, well, it mainly applies within the Christian community. Some say, no, it can be lived out in public life as well.
And I was also wondering if this thought process of loving your enemy would lead him to a different way of summarizing the Torah.
Well, it's interesting. One of the key places he does that is to the rich young man. And he puts it as a question. What are the two great commands? And then we get into this reworking, as you say, of Torah. I don't see any reason to object to it seeing it as a different interpretation, because I think Jesus was, as his disciples called him, a rabbi. What does a rabbi do? A rabbi teaches Torah. Every one of the rabbis have their own take. Not everyone would agree with Hillel, okay? So rabbinic teaching can take different, just as Christian teachers, take different approaches to what's most central and what's not as central. Okay?
Great, thank you.
Okay, folks, you gotta jump in here. I need some help. I'm dying up here. Mark.
Bill, given the golden and silver rule, how can we as a society justify being anti-immigrant?
We can't. Except, and this raises a profound question that Myron's pushing on here, so I might as well let the cat out of the bag. Another befuddling thing in all of our lives and in the history of thought, what is the relationship between moral obligation and political obligations? Now, the modern nation state is built on the assumption that one must have control over a territory. Without control over territory, there is no nation, right? And therefore, there has to be ways to have and to protect borders, both physical and human. And that's where our immigration policies come from. But morally speaking, it's a problem. Because there is no reason why I should exclude anyone from my country. Well, it wouldn't be a country, from the locality. This is a debate about the good of locality and sociality, those different levels of types of goods. Morally speaking, I shouldn't have such boundaries. Which means that the sensitive moral person is always living in some tension with their political community. If the political community becomes so egregious in violating moral norms, then the moral person has to resist. In my judgment, This is what went on in the civil rights movement. It's the backbone of conscientious objection. For each of us, that forces us to ask the question of, do we place the moral good higher in our scale of values than the social good of political life, or inverse? Now, I know I'm going on long, but I am going on long. I'm sorry. Yes, Beverly. Did that get to it, Myron? Beverly.
I was just going to say, isn't it based on that some people see it as a zero-sum game?
Yes.
That if more people come, they will take away. Isn't that? I'm using that as an immigration, is I have heard, if you hear the rhetoric, is they will take away jobs. In other words, they view it as a zero-sum game.
You're
I was going to.
Absolutely right. I want to reply to that in a moment, but first, Go ahead, Marcy. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say pretty much the same thing in a different way as Beverly, that what I have heard people say is that we need to take care of people in the United States first. We don't have enough resources for people in the United States, and then we're going to extend them to other people. And then even the same thing with, well, if I give my money to these people so that they can eat more, how will I have enough for my own family?
Yes. Those are questions about when there's a conflict or a tension between self-regard and other regard. Mm-hmm. And I hope you see, one of the things I'm doing in this course is giving you a toolkit of ideas rather than trying to answer every problem. Why? Because our job in life is answering problems. And if you take that away from people, you've taken away their moral agency. But let me and I know we're running out of time, correct? Or not? Yes? Okay. One last thing then. When you show care to another person, Beverly, what happens to that care? Is it lost? What happens?
It's usually reciprocated.
Exactly. When we love, when we respect, when we care for others, ironically, more respect, love, and care comes into existence. That's what I was getting at about the moral good, about it being a kind of creative activity. So the golden and silver rules are a way also to avoid a zero-sum game. Because they're saying that if you treat people with respect, most of the time it's going to be reciprocated. There will be more respect. It's not like you're going to lose it, right? So this is one of the interesting paradoxes of human existence, that there are certain things that are increased by giving them away. Love is increased by loving more. Respect is increased by respecting more people. It's a really interesting phenomena that there are certain things in human existence that are increased, empowered by being given away. And we don't normally think of that in our culture. Okay, I've rambled on long enough tonight. Wait, did we have another question?
Yeah. Can I ask
Deborah.
a quick question?
Yes.
Yeah,
Quick.
yeah, quick question. So, enlightenment or transcendence in Christianity, we are saved by Jesus Christ, and in Hinduism, warrior can be saved through the war. So what I'm pointing is transcendence, enlightenment in religion does not guarantee about morality. So how do you see about enlightenment through morality and also enlightenment through the religions. There is some different tension in my observation.
Well, what you've just noted is that we have been looking at, through the Gita and through the Bible, we've been looking at Hindu and ancient Israelite morality. Our job as ethicists is to think critically about that and sometimes criticize. And I myself would have some real moral difficulties in thinking that slaughtering people in a warfare, even if it was justified, is somehow the way to redemption. And then we would be in an ethical, rather than a moral, an ethical debate with Hindi scholars. Yeah. But notice, ethical debate, not warfare. Right? We're trying to find the grounds to have reasonable debates about things we differ on, rather than falling back into warfare. There's a famous ancient statement that goes, civilization is the triumph of persuasion over force. Ethics tries to address the problem of human conflict through rational persuasion. Okay? And changing what people care about. We can come back to this at some point. Okay, I've gone on too long. Thank you all. We'll see you, I hope, next week. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.